Hello, everyone. And for those who are joining us from the Philippines, good morning. We welcome you to this third iteration of this lecture series, States of the Filipino Novel. And for this lecture, we have Dr. Paul Nadal, who will talk about Wilfrido and Nolledo. To introduce us, the series and the lecture and also the speaker, we have the Program Director of the Literary and Cultural Studies Program, Dr. Charlie Samuyaveri.
Many thanks, Francis. Welcome everyone to the third iteration of a lecture series that we have titled States of the Filipino Novel. The series is being brought to you by the Literary and Cultural Studies program and Exploding Galaxies. I wish to thank my colleagues in the Literary and Cultural Studies program, particularly Luisa Gomez and Francis Soliano, for spearheading the organizing for this particular lecture. We also wish to thank Professor Paul Nadal from Princeton for agreeing to present his paper on Wilfrido Nolledo, which is actually part of his forthcoming book, which is titled Remittances, Literary and Economic. The lecture series is organized, like I said, by the Literary and Cultural Studies program and Exploding Galaxies. And so we wish to thank Mara Cosson and Nicole Kunyang Aboitiz for allowing us to bring this particular exciting event to all of you. We are joined by a diverse set of people coming from the United States of America, Spain, Canada, Japan, and Australia. The institutions are equally diverse. From the United States, we have folks from Colombia and NYU, even as far as Spain. And locally, there are representatives from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, the University of Santo Tomas, the Philippine Normal University, even the Mapua School of Medicine, the University of the Cordilleras in the north, and Capi State University from the Visayas. Uh, this lecture comes to you following two others, which were held first in January, which focus on Jose Rizal. The second one was held in March with Dr. Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo, uh, giving her lecture on the Filipino novelist Linda T. Casper. This particular lecture series is intended to highlight, the trajectories of Philippine literature in English, and the collaboration with Exploding Galaxies represents our commitment to promoting Philippine literature in English, not only in the Philippines, but also abroad. The Philippine literature in English forms the core of our identity as a program at the Ateneo. And as a program, we're also engaged in the promotion of the study of Philippine literature in English. In fact, we are set to launch the Ateneo Archive of Philippine literature in English. And as you can see, the character of Philippine literature in English is trans-Pacific. And so we have here with us Professor Nadal to give his lecture, like I said, on Wilfrido Nolledo. Professor Paul Nadal is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Princeton University. And his book is forthcoming in spring next year. And Nolledo is the subject of one of the chapters. Professor Nadal's article, Cold War Remittance Economy, U.S. Creative Writing, and the Importation of New Criticism into the Philippines, was published in American Quarterly and was recognized by the American Literature Society, and the article was selected as the best in any field of American literature. Professor Nadal earned his PhD in rhetoric from the University of California, Berkeley, where he worked with Professors Colleen Lai and Judith Butler. Friends in the Philippines and elsewhere, please join me in welcoming Professor Nadal.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie, for that really generous introduction. And what a pleasure and really deep honor to be able to speak to this audience in particular, and to share my research on this really remarkable writer, Wilfredo Nolledo, and his just quite stunning novel, 1970 novel, But for the Lovers, which was published in, like I said, in 1970, and has an American edition published by Dalkey Press. But when Professor Nicole Cohen-Boites shared with me that Exploding Galaxies was going to publish a Philippine edition of But for the Lovers here. I was just so ecstatic. I have the copy here, and it's just quite an exquisite artifact. If you don't have a copy yet, I highly recommend that you get one. Okay, so I'll go ahead and dive right into my talk, which is about 40 minutes. And I do have some slides. They're not fancy at all. They're very rudimentary. It's just some images and then quotations from the novel, so that you can get a sense of the language, the texture, the style. Because hopefully what will come through in my remarks today is just um, yeah, in terms of But for the Lover's place in the history of the Filipino novel in English, it really is quite a maverick text. It's highly experimental, it's irreverent. And one of the arguments that I will make in my talk today is that unlike previous novels in English that came before Nolledo, which one could characterize as really following the example of Jose Rizal's social realist novels, Nolledo decided, I'm not going to write another Rizal rewrite. He decided to do something completely different, and the result of which is this really quite dense, but worthwhile novel to read. All right. Um, so as Professor Varick mentioned, I'm Paul Nadal. I'm an assistant professor of English at Princeton University, and where I teach courses in Asian American literature, contemporary fiction, literary theory, and I also teach graduate seminars in Marxism, and interdisciplinary approaches to the novel. And the talk today on Nolledo is part of this larger book project that I'm titling Remittances, Literary and Economic. And what I'm doing there is taking this concept from political economy, remittances, which, of course, in the Philippines is a ubiquitous object. Remittances refer to the sum of money that migrant workers send back. And I'm using this economic term to think about the genesis of the Filipino novel in English as itself, the novel in English as itself a kind of remittance, in as much as what we have is generations upon generations of Filipino writers who end up studying or writing abroad in the diaspora and then repatriating or better yet, remitting their manuscripts to the Philippines. And upon their homecoming, as it were, they would be valorized as parts of Philippine national literature. So there's this really interesting trans-Pacific exchange that prefigures the migration of workers and the repatriation of the money or the wages that they send back, right? So I'm using remittances to write this literary history of the Filipino novel in English that itself helps us to understand this larger economic transformation of the Philippines into a labor export economy. Okay. All right. So Nolledo's But for the Lovers. So it was published in 1970 at a time when literary experimentation in the Philippines found itself in curious synchrony with larger currents of social and political upheaval. Let me put up my slide. I just realized I'm not sharing it. Um, let's see, how do I do this? Is my screen being shared?
We don't see your slides yet, Paul.
No? Okay, how do I do this? Apologies. Um, okay. Share. Okay, what about now?
Yes, we can see you. Thanks.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, so let me begin again. So, published in 1970, obviously a very pivotal, tumultuous beginning of a decade. Um, and the book before us, But for the Lovers, it's very Baroque. It's structurally unruly, linguistically excessive, and defiantly difficult to get categorize. Is it a war novel? Is it historical fiction? Is it kind of serialist? Is it even magic realist? Right? This is a kind of genre that's being labeled precisely at this moment. Nick Joaquin, writing in the same year that But for the Lovers was published, captured something of the strange charisma. He described Nolledo as a local cult, and then more famously as the young magus of language. Nolledo, he wrote, Joaquin, is to Philippine prose what Jose Garcia Villa is to its verse. End quote. The comparisons were not thrown lightly. In the decades since, Nolledo has been hailed by Bienvenido Lumbera as a moment when, in his words, the Filipino writer may be said to have finally arrived. The writer Alfred Yuson called Nolledo the most distinguished and outstanding writer of his generation. In the US, we have a writer like Robert Coover going further still, declaring But for the Lovers, quote, one of the best books of the decade. Such declarations, lofty as they are, tend to signal a deeper anxiety, the sense that Noliedo's arrival was somehow both too early and too late. His name has lingered in the footnotes of literary history, his novel referred to over and over again as an undiscovered masterpiece, right? So that's a curious kind of phenomenon. When it came out, it had a lot of attention, praise from both sides of the Pacific, but then it kind of receded into obscurity. But thanks to the new edition by Exploding Galaxies, hopefully it'll be, it won't just be an underground classic anymore. Um, but there are, as it turns out, structural reasons for this obscurity on this novel. For one, Noliedo's literary career was relatively brief. He did not cultivate a public persona, say like Nick Joaquin, and he published only one novel. But what a novel and what a life. A native of Manila, Noliedo studied literature and journalism at the University of Santo Tomas, where he served as a literary editor of Blue Quill. Known to his friends as Ding, he was already producing prize-winning short stories by the early 1960s. Noliedo's short stories quickly became touchstones for young writers navigating the ambiguous terrain of post-war Philippine modernism. His one-act play, Goodbye, My Gentle, was staged alongside Nick Joaquin's Portrait of the Artist as Filipino, two works that, in different ways, introduced what critic Doreen Fernandez later called a language of experimentalism to the post-war Filipino stage. Um, so I have a little bit more description about his work, but his other like short stories, drama work, but I think I'll skip that, and I'll just say that by the mid 1960s, right, when Noliedo was just getting his foot into kind of the Philippine literary scene, he wasn't yet in the United States. He his journalism, his plays got the attention of the U.S. State Department. And this attention ensnared him into the circuits of Cold War cultural diplomacy, or what in my American Quarterly piece called Cold War remittance economy, which I do all this kind of archival research. I showed canonical figures in Philippine literary history like NVM Gonzalez, Nick Joaquin himself, Ben Santos. This post-war generation really were all part of the Iowa program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So I do this kind of archival reconstruction of this literary history. And Noliedo coming out, he emerged in the mid 1960s, early 1970s. So he really is kind of like the generation after the Iowa efflorescence. Um, so perhaps it's not surprising that he did get the attention of the U.S. State Department, and in 1966 he received a Fulbright to pursue an MFA at the University of Iowa. This placed him in the orbit of Paul Engel, the famously evangelical director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, who was in the process of launching a second initiative. So he had already Paul Engel already had the Iowa Writers Workshop, but by the mid 1960s, this is where Noliedo comes in. Paul Engel was interested in a second program, what he called the International Writing Program, the IWP. And so Noliedo was his recruitment to Iowa, along with, I think, 8 other writers, not only from the Philippines, but in Southeast Asia. This cohort was really instrumental in Paul Engel's project of realizing the second program that he calls the International Writing Program, or the IWP, which is still running today. Okay, so Noliedo was written entirely during his years as an MFA student in Iowa. Um, and I think that it was a workshop novel, right? Imagine that this novel that we have before us, this was essentially an MFA thesis, right? And um, I one of, I've spent a lot of time reading the novel, and I think one of the explanations for its linguistic density, its stylistic play, I think has to do with the fact that Noliedo found himself at a writer's workshop, right? Where you have these American teachers really trying to indoctrinate you to modernist criteria of form, of what makes for a well-formed kind of novel, etc. And Noliedo just did not have any interest in actually following the rules. So there's a kind of refusal of the dictates of form that Nolledo found himself in at Iowa. And I have a kind of anecdote to support this claim a little later in my talk. Um, okay, so what did Nolledo try to do? He tried to write a historical novel about the Japanese occupation of Manila during World War II. And in doing that, what he ended up achieving is this prose style that's irreverent, um, um, episodes, chapters full of hallucinatory layerings of genres, of images, of motifs. And one can read it as Noliedo assimilating modernism, kind of a modernist aesthetic. But I think Noliedo was still very much invested in a kind of tradition of realism, um, by which I mean that he was still he still wanted to write a socially relevant literature that could speak to um, to the Philippine nation. This is, I guess, the inheritance from Rizal, right? Like we get the canonical argument from Benedict Anderson that these are actually coeval social formations, that you can't have the nation without the novel. And Benedict Anderson, Rizal is a kind of paradigmatic example. So Noliedo himself, right, 1970, still I think wanted to follow the example of Rizal, right, a novel that can essentially express the Philippine nation, but he wanted to do it differently than his predecessors. Okay. Okay. So oh, this is a review of Noliedo's novel by Nick Joaquin. Nick Joaquin was writing in his pseudonym, in his pen name, but this is where he calls Noliedo kind of like the writer of the generation. Okay, so those who haven't read the novel, let me give a really quick plot synopsis. All right. But for the Lovers is at its most accessible level a novel about wartime Manila in its final days under Japanese occupation. But any attempt to summarize it too neatly risks missing what it makes so singular and so disorienting. The plot, such as it is, revolves around a young orphan named Alma, who is violently abused, sexually abused by a Japanese soldier and taken in by a former circus clown named Hidalgo de Anuncio, who pines for the lost grandeur of the Spanish Philippines. Around her spiral a large and unruly cast. Amoran, a guitar-playing boy who becomes her companion, Alma, the young heroine. Major Shigura, a Japanese officer fantasizing a pan-Asian empire. And then we have Captain Johnny Winter, an American airman who drops bombs by day and drifts through Alma's dreams by night. And then we have the character Diogracias, a guerrilla leader, a Filipino guerrilla leader, plotting a revolution not just against Japan, but against empire itself in any form. Their stories, right, this like really wide-ranging cast of characters, their stories intersect in the ruined spaces of a Manila completely undone. It's like almost like bursting in its seams, right? So uh, in when you open the novel, the Manila we get, it's not just Quiapo, it's not just like Intramuros. Noliedo takes us to the brothels, to bomb shelters, to nightclubs, to rice queues, to makeshift chapels and interrogation cells, right? So he really gets into every layer of Manila social life. Structurally, the novel is told in 36 loosely linked chapters. And and Nolledo decided to just dispense with conventional plotting and focalization. His novel shifts constantly in terms of perspective, sometimes third person, sometimes second, sometimes no discernible narrative consciousness at all. It also slides across registers from realist description to surreal allegory, from slapstick farce to stream of consciousness interiority. The language serves widely. English collides with Tagalog and Spanish. High lyricism breaks into street slang. Liturgical Latin gives way to coarse profanity, right? So that's one of the, I think, incredible features of this novel is that it's so multilingual. Tagalog, Spanish, English, high lyricism, high erudition of liturgical Latin to like street slang, right? And Noliedo's genius is that he was able fluently to move across these linguistic stylistic registers, right? What readers will notice too, especially on the opening pages, is that, you know, if you're looking for plot, there is plot, there is action, but I think what Noliedo is actually more interested in is to really almost suffocate you with a kind of atmospheric density. That Manila, the Manila of World War II is just so full of life. It's like surplus life. And I think that's registered stylistically and structurally. Okay. All right. So like I said, but for the lovers was so that was a plot synopsis. Hopefully that gives you enough to work with. Um, and now let me give you a sense of the the language of the text. So the novel, this is how the novel begins. So when you open the page, it's a prologue, and this is its first sentence. He was beginning to eat flowers, and the crescent moon was in his eyes when he awoke again. Right? It's like, what kind of a novel begins this way, right? It's he was beginning to eat flowers, and the crescent moon was in his eyes when he woke again. So it's 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 um it's poetic, it's layered with multiple images, it's almost surrealistic. And I think here Nolledo must have also been reading Garcia Marquez and kind of the Latin American magical realist that was coming to the fore. But I think there's also echoes here of Jose Garcia Villa, Filipino writers like Gregorio Brillantes. And of course, in the American literature side, we might hear a little bit of Faulkner too. And in the European high modernists, Nolledo certainly read Joyce and Proust. I think the fact that Nolledo wanted to focus on Manila and kind of follow his characters kind of chronologically by day, I think it's a little Joycean too. So I think, in short, like I think Nolledo was caught in multiple literary traditions, and I think he wanted to kind of bring them all together in But for the Lovers. Okay. Um, so some of the questions that I want to explore a little bit more closely today is not just what kind of a novel But for the Lovers is. Is it realist? Is it modernist? Is it national allegory? Is it surrealist? Is it stream of consciousness? Is it irrealist, et cetera, right? Um, um, Ultimately, I think these kind of classificatory questions aren't very helpful. But I think the more interesting question, at least to me, is looking at the kind of formal strategies that Nolledo employed in his novel, and where did those strategies come from vis-a-vis Philippine literary history, but also how these aesthetic strategies, the play in perspective, the use of multiple languages, code switching, et cetera, how these aesthetic strategies might speak to the historical moment that he was writing in, right? 1970, right? What was going on in the Philippines then? And the state of not only the novel, right, but also Philippine politics more broadly, right? Already you can kind of see kind of this is 1970, so we have, what will be the kind of the rise of the Marcos regime. All right, so Nolledo immerses us in the final days of the Japanese occupation, staging the moment as one saturated with overlapping imperial regimes, right? Spanish, American, and Japanese, right? They remain entangled in World War II, layered onto each other. And this is reflected in the mixture of language in the novel, right? Spanish, American. I don't think there's, I don't recall Japanese, but I mean, there are some Japanese references for sure, but maybe the Japanese language itself isn't actually exploited. Historical references unfold in the novels. We get MacArthur, we get Yamashita, we get the death of Bataan March, the Battle of Leyte, etc. These names and these historical references don't just anchor the story, they drift through it like a kind of ambient signal, right? What coheres the novel is kind of the really the thickness of the voices that we get. So we get landlords, landladies, beggars, scavengers, children, and Filipino guerrillas, right? So not just the kind of high class people, but those whose voices and those whose stories are not often kind of foregrounded, in official discourses, but certainly also in the fiction of the time too. Um, Let me give you another kind of sense of the kind of narrative voice that we get in this novel. So I already shared with you the opening line. But here's the narrator when he introduces us to Mulave Omaran, who's a character in the novel. He's a street scavenger and an unlikely companion to the novel's orphaned hero. So this is how the narrator describes this street scavenger. A scintilla of saliva hung at the corners of the mouth throughout speech. The nose was broken at the bridge. Its piping sniffles seemed synchronized with asthmatic exhalations from the chest. And then here's another character, a landlady of the boarding house. Her name is Tira Colombo. Actually, she's my favorite character. She's hilarious. There's a chapter of her that might be one of my favorite set scenes in the entire Filipino novel in English canon. Okay, so this is a description of this landlady. At 48, 200 pounds flat, she waddled about her protectorate with the subtlety of a hippopotamus, still partial to a phosphorescent paint that made her oval face glitter in the dark. Right? And then here's a description of the beggars outside the Quiapo church. They opened their bodies like the pages of a doctor's manual on diseases, literature enough for the unlettered and the incredulous. So I share with you these passages, these these descriptions of the characters, right? Because they give you a taste of the prose style that we're working here. Um, very elevated, polysyllabic, right? We get adjectives that one usually doesn't encounter in everyday speech and even in written in literature, right? So what's going on here? What kind of narrator offers these kinds of images? We have here a narrator whose omniscience is not only cognitive, let's describe it as also linguistic. We have a narrator who moves between registers, tonal registers, so from the sardonic to the clinical to the hyperpoetic. And we have a narrator who wields language as a kind of even almost like a weapon, right? Nick Joaquin, again, once asked of Nolledo, not an admirer, not in very positive terms, but Nick Joaquin goes, his Nolledo's prose was dazzling, all right, but what the hell was the guy saying, right? So that was Nick Joaquin. The answer I want to suggest lies not beneath the dazzle and the kind of pyrotechnics of the prose, but in a sense in it, right? That the novel's verbal excess is not decorative, it's the subject of the novel itself. Okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. Um, I think the kind of linguistic excess and the stylistic density that we have here, I think goes back to Nolledo's experience as a MFA student at Iowa, right? Iowa is not New York City. It's kind of the rural part of the United States. And every time I study these writers, I always try to imagine them. It's like, wow, they're in an American creative writing workshop. They're brown and I'm sure their alterity is always, marked and, they're reminded of it constantly. And so I think the kind of linguistic performance that we have in but for the lovers, I think comes out directly from being in that kind of very controlled disciplinarian space of creative writing, of American creative writing. Another way of putting this is that the kind of stylistic linguistic performance that we have in these sentences constitute a rebuttal to the racialized charge that Filipinos lack linguistic competence or linguistic control, that the way Filipinos speak, the way Filipinos use language, right, is without precision, without intelligence, without kind of stylistic verve. So, But for the Lovers offers a kind of rebuttal to this and a completely different vision and performance together. Uh, Multilingualism, as I already mentioned, we get Tagalog, English, Spanish, street slang, liturgical Latin, military code. It's like Nolledo saying, it's like, oh yeah, well, I can speak all these other languages, better than you can. And he does this all together in a syntax that resists closure and easy interpretation. Okay. Um, Another example, just to give you another sense of this. So this is of the language. This is Alma, so the main character of this historical novel about the Japanese occupation in Manila. And Alma, she's an orphan girl, right? She's kind of like this war refugee. And here's a passage that describes this central character, and I'll read it slowly. She, Alma, she was taught grammar, syntax, conjugation in the morning. At night, she absorbed the adenoidal dialectics of a city that Amoron slit open to her like a goitrous throat. And then further, her mornings were mannered and orchidaceous with Hidalgo's invocations of dawns and dowagers. Her evenings, while malodorous, were more bithic with Amoron's influx of urchins and lepers. Right? So, to me, what's interesting about this passage is that the narrator is describing the main hero of the novel and places her in a scene of learning in a classroom. And so I think it's kind of a meta moment in the novel where what we get here is a kind of a staging of the scene of instruction, right? Where we have a Filipino subject being taught grammar, syntax, conjugation. And then the description of that scene of instruction is itself kind of like a performance of what is learned, as it were, right? I mean, when I read these sentences, my profession is to read literature, but still, when I read a phrase like adenoidal dialectics or morbific and influx of urchins and lepers, I mean, those are, very, very dense, um, not innocent, just way of describing things. Okay. Um, So these passages I've shared with you give us a sense not only of Nolledo's irreverent narrator, but of a larger stylistic project, one in which verbal play becomes a compositional rule. So the prose isn't just florid or eccentric, it's deliberately stylized and deliberately excessive. Right? That the excess is kind of part of the political project. Okay. So, I'm not the first one to notice this. Critics have described Nolledo's prose in a variety of ways. Highly complex, one critic says phantasmagoric, another critic says luxurious, intoxicating. The adjectives go on and on and on. And yet these descriptions, while not inaccurate, often fail to capture what is rhetorically specific about the style. So if we return to the examples I just read, what emerges is a set of recurring features: a preference for slightly archaic diction, euphuistic constructions, a surplus of adjectives, frequent word doubling, and oxymoronic juxtaposition. The prose moves effortlessly across these kinds of strategies, right? Sometimes within a single sentence. And all of this affects a particular kind of humor. And one of the things I want to, one of the things that I want to kind of advertise about Nolledo's work, and hopefully it will give reason for you to buy the Exploding Galaxies copy and read it for yourself. But for the Lovers is a hilarious novel. It's so funny. Yeah, it's really dense, it's hard to read, but I mean it's just hilarious. And because I mean one, it's just full of wordplay, full of puns, which is like so Filipino, right? So here's one example. It's like not emphasized at all. It's just like this passing line. But if you pause and think about it, it's like, oh my God, what a pun. So the line reads, dust, comma, capital of the Tao. Tao obviously being the Filipino word for the people, the masses, right? On first glance, this unassuming line, reads like a poetic aside, cryptic, slightly mournful. But when spoken aloud, it reveals itself as a compact three-way pun. Dust, capital of the Tao. Dust capital obviously echoes Das Kapital, right? Karl Marx's great analysis of capital accumulation and its discontents. But it also signals more plainly that dust is now the capital, the degraded currency of the Filipino people, right? Manila has turned into dust, right? Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Tao here is not just a Tagalog word for person, but used in its honorific sense, right? Like tao po, etc., etc. I'm at your door. The line lands like a joke muttered under her breath, absurd but too cutting to dismiss. In the span of just 5 words, Das Kapital of the Tao, Nolledo fuses Marxist critique, imperial ruin, and Filipino politeness. That it works at all is less coincidence than a kind of historical fluency, the kind only available to someone trained by force in several incompatible languages and competing styles all at once. right? So these are not just clever linguistic games. They are, I would argue, forms of linguistic historiography. The novel's way of storing history not only in plot, but in sound, syntax, and semantic overload. One last stylistic feature that I want to highlight today is what I'm going to call structural paranomia. Okay. Paronomasia is a technical term for punning. Okay, when words with similar sounds are made to resonate or collide in meaning, as in the dust capital of the Tao. But now I want to point to a kind of broader punning that's happening at the novel in terms at the structural level, hence structural paronomasia or structural punning. He scales it up, Nolledo does. Entire chapters are linked by verbal echoes, where a phrase at the end of one chapter is recast, twisted, or revoiced at the beginning of the next, right? So in this way, the kind of punning that works at the level of the kind of diction of word gets scaled up to a kind of structural and principle how the chapters are sequenced, right? And so this is his way of kind of stitching together the fragments, the episodic fragments. And I think there's a kind of logic to that in how he was trying to rewrite Philippine history via fiction. I have a whole lot about kind of his intervention into national historiography of the 1950s, 1960s. I don't have enough space or time to do that here. But like we can think of Agoncillo's The Revolt of the Masses as an important intertext of Nolledo's But for the Lovers, right? Agoncillo's The Revolt of the Masses centered not Rizal but Bonifacio, and therefore the people, and in having displaced Rizal, kind of this mestizo ilustrado, Agoncillo made possible a kind of way of writing national historiography that encouraged a different kind of style and mood and tone. And I think Nolledo's But for the Lover is has decided not to rewrite Rizal, but write a new kind of grammar of literature altogether. And I think it was inspired by this debate happening in the other discipline in the history department. Okay. Okay. I want to share. These are the kind of the structural paranomasia I was talking about. Um, but I don't know how long I've been speaking. For this, okay. Let me share with you this quote. I found it in the archives. I was trying to look for the original image of the document, but I have like 1,000 documents, so I wasn't able to get it on time here, but I do have a typed version of it. So this is Nolledo, recalling his first semester at Iowa. Okay. So this is his first person account of what it was like being a Filipino MFA student in the late 1960s. And this was when he was trying to write this novel that we're talking about. Nolledo goes, terrible, terrible, my first 3 months. Now, I'm not saying there was a positive air of hostility. Oh no, nothing as crude as that. On the contrary, the inhabitants were nice, quite polite. It's interesting that he uses the word inhabitants to talk about his classmates and his teachers. Um, that was the trouble. Being the lone Asian in my class, I became a sort of oddity. It even surprised the attendant eggheads that I spoke English at all. I would go home to my crummy little room and brood, and so it went for 1,001 lousy nights. Right? So this little anecdote, I just imagine Nolledo, right? Clearly he's gifted with, you know, this aesthetic sensibility, this, mastery of the English language. And I'm sure he's demonstrated it again and again in front of his peers and his teachers. But because of his, how he looks, because he's Filipino, right, because he's a from a country formerly colonized by the United States. Um, and the irony, of course, is that the United States propagated the English language, that he nevertheless encountered, people being surprised that he spoke English at all, let alone write fiction in English. And so I think this imputation of linguistic deficiency or incompetence, I think definitely informed the kind of stylistic performance that we have here in Nolledo. Okay. So this gets us, this offers a glimpse into the conditions under which Nolledo was writing. It takes us to the classroom scene, to the scene of the creative writing workshop, of being read, misunderstood, exoticized, or simply not recognized at all. Noliedo's sentences, the ones that I've shared, in this light becomes more than displays of linguistic bravado. They dramatize and push back against the racialized imputation of the Filipinos' linguistic lack. If anything, the novel, the style of the novel, overperforms, and in this kind of overperformance resides its historical political project. Okay, all right, so I let me go ahead and conclude. I have a whole section on Agoncillo, the revolt of the masses, but I think I'll skip that. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So what I was trying to suggest is that Noliedo's style departs from earlier Filipino novels in English, in as much as Noliedo decided not to follow the template of Rizal's social realist novels. And in this departure from following the Rizal template of writing socially relevant novels that can express the desires, ambitions, and history of the Philippine nation, Noliedo developed a kind of his own language, right? That was multilingual, that's tonally experimental, that code switches, et cetera, right? And in the historical section, part of my research on Nolledo, I show that there's a parallel to what Agoncillo was doing with the revolt of the masses, right? And dethroning and decentering Rizal and focusing on the masses, Bonifacio, etc. Okay. And with this density, opacity of the novel, with the Agoncillo intertext in mind and the his ambivalence and his response to the colossal influence of Jose Rizal in Philippine letters, I think ultimately what Noliedo was doing was staging Philippine history as a problem of legibility, right? Of a challenge to the reader of how we process language, recognize structure, and apprehend the past. I think ultimately this is what he was doing, not more in the impossibility of writing Philippine history. I think he was actually trying to attempt to write a kind of total picture of Philippine history, but in a fictional mode. But that any representation that presents itself as kind of final is suspicious for Noliedo. And I think that's one of the lessons that the novel teaches to the reader. Okay, so when the manuscript of Noliedo's novel arrived on Nick Joaquin's desk at the Philippines Free Press in 1970, Nick Joaquin called Noliedo, quote, our cultural hero. Right? Our cultural hero. And when Joaquin wrote those words, the cultural reference were already shifting. Rizal's image had begun to recede. Marcos's authoritarianism loomed, and a new historical formation what scholars will call kind of labor export and kind of remittance economy was beginning to emerge. And this is kind of part of where I Nolledo is part of my thinking of remittances more broadly in the book. And I think the significance, historical significance of But for the Lovers is really how the counter pedagogical impulse that we have here is Nolledo really trying to use the novel form, to think across empire, labor, trauma, military and war violence, and the possibility of a revolution yet to come. All right. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the Q&A. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for giving us a very insightful lecture on But for the Lovers, and also on the writerly context, no, of Wilfrido Nolledo. No? So we now open the virtual floor for questions and comments from the participants. You may use the raise hand function of Zoom and unmute yourself to ask your question or give your comments. If I may, Paul, I wish to ask probably the first question. Yeah,
Sure.
as you've said in the lecture, Joaquin has given high praises for But for the Lovers, in 1970. But as you've mentioned also toward the end of your lecture, a lot of things are, as we know, are bound to happen. You know? So martial law, and then of course the People Power Revolution, and we can say the relative failure of that revolution that brings us to the present Philippines today. No? So my question is, how do you think, and all of these events, by the way, probably prove to us how magical realist the Philippine situation really is. No? And so my question is, how do you think would this rediscovery of, if we can say that, no, because we're as excited as you in the republication of Nolledo's novel, um, how do you think would a new generation of readers and of critics respond to this work in the 21st century? Yeah, given again the decades of experience that we've gone through after 1970.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You know, yeah, it makes me wish that Nolledo was still alive to write a novel for the 21st century, because one of the features of the novel that I foregrounded is that it's really interested in juxtapositions and doublings, the puns, right? And we need a novelist. We need not just a novelist, we need writers, poets, dramatists, in the plural, to to really make sense of this disorienting present where we get the repetition, absurd comical repetition of the past. Obviously one being Marcos being, um, Marcos Aquino, kind of the dynasties just kind of roll over and reproduce themselves. So there is something kind of magical realist about that, the kind of layering and uncanniness of the situation. But I think it's also still quite under theorized. Um, one can turn to Freud's uncanny. One can turn to, I don't know, kind of absurd poetics of modernism, etc. or I'm thinking in Philippine studies, the idea of unfinished history, um, and all that. But I think more has to be done. I do want to say that someone like Gina Apostol, I think, is a writer who's thinking through the contradictions, conundrums of the present. So, Apostle's novel, The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, is essentially trying to bring the Filipino Revolution against Spain to speak to the contemporary. Insurrecto, right? The Philippine-American War is kind of refracted um, to make sense of Duterte regime. And Apostle's novel is very much invested in kind of doublings too. So um, the question of whether that's magical realist or not, it's an open question. But yeah, I think so to conclude my remarks to your question, my response to your question, yeah, I mean, like if there are writers, poets, visual artists, cultural workers in the room, read Noliedo and see what kind of inspiration you get. And he was writing in the 1970s, and I think we need more works like this that can really make sense of the 2020s. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Charlie?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for that really remarkable and rich and robust uh lecture on Nolledo. And I'm grateful that we're doing this together, and that we're doing this with Exploding Galaxies, and that Exploding Galaxies is contributing to creating more interests, not only in Nolledo, but also in the past that actually can help us explain the work of his novel. And
Mm-hmm.
part of the argument that you're making is that Nolledo is overperforming, and that the overperformance actually demonstrates the political import of his work. Like
Yeah.
I wonder how you think about, that work in relation to like the context of the Cold War. You've
Yeah.
referenced the Cold War, and you suggest, for example, that Nolledo went to Iowa at around the same time that the International Writers Program was being established. So it was
Mm-hmm.
essentially the internationalization of American literature, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Nolledo comes after the generation of NVM Gonzalez, Bienvenido Santos, and others. Like my mind is actually exploding at this point because I don't know like where to begin. But I'm just like interested in what you can say about the Cold War, like in
Mm-hmm.
relation to the question of decolonization, because I think like you've referenced the Cold War, but you don't mention decolonization. And
Sure.
in the quotation that you gave us earlier, das capital of the Tao, that references, as he put it, Manila in ruins, right? And soon after the ruins of Manila, we would see the emergence of the Filipino post-colony in 1946. So, like, where do we place Nolledo in relation to these historical contexts?
Yeah, that's a really question, and thanks for so much for that, Charlie, because you formulated uh, a problem that I wasn't able to grasp quite clearly yet, and so your question is helping me see it more clearly. Um, so the post-war generation, so we have writers
Here.
like Santos and VM Gonzalez, um, um, and Nick Joaquin really, they were kind of the post-war generation that studied or abroad or under fellowship. They were writing when, the Philippines was just newly independent. And I think for that generation, there was a sense that it wasn't the kind of independence that they had envisioned, right? That it was kind of just a continuation of the same. And so we have someone like Nick Joaquin, at least in the early 50s, then harkening back to kind of Spain too, for a different antecedent for imagining the future, kind of thinking a different grammar of decolonization. I think for someone like Nolledo, I I don't I I think the nation as such isn't the immediate social referent, right? Like clearly he was talking about the Philippines, and he wants to tell a story about the Philippines, but the Manila that we get is almost unrecognizably Manila because he just foregrounds its cosmopolitan character. Um, so it's an internationalism that I think is part of kind of a history of decolonization. I mean, it's certainly part of the global history of decolonization, but an internationalism that might not have been as foregrounded for earlier writers. Um, so that's one provisional answer, that we have a shift of emphasis from the nation to something like the international, and that's registered stylistically in the kinds of novels that we get. That said, though, I would say that Nolledo is closer to Joaquin than Nolledo is to someone like NVM Gonzalez, right? And NVM Gonzalez and Joaquin were writing at they're part of the same generation. So it's not surprising to me that, when Joaquin started reading Nolledo, he basically found a younger version of himself. He's like, oh yeah, kind of this maximalist style. Um, but yeah, I'll think about your question, but really, Noliedo for literary historians is such an interesting figure to return to because he is this transitional figure. Um, what kind of Filipino nationalism was he imagining and invoking in his novel? The way he brought novel and nation together is not the same as, the what came before. Um, but at the same time, it was the only novel that he wrote. It was 1970, so it was right before kind of the apex of Marcos too. And literature after Marcos really was a reaction formation to Marcos, right? So in that sense, Nolledo initiated something that other writers didn't really complete too. So he's like kind of, yeah, it's a very interesting figure. But I'll think about your question about decolonization more. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm just like thinking, like when you were trying to explain Nolledo to like in the latter part of your answer, that Nolledo is closer to Joaquin than he was to Gonzalez, and I was thinking of what Zobel was doing
Mm,
in terms of the introduction of modern art in the Philippines, also in the 1950s, right?
mm,
So like Zobel was trying to change the visual language in the same way that Noliado was trying to come up with a new language with which to express Philippine
mm,
experience.
mhm.
Thank you, Paul. I think Anna has a question, Francis.
Yes. Anna has a comment actually in the chat box, and probably for all the participants, if for some reason you cannot use your mic, typing your question or comment in the chat box is also an option. So I'll read Anna's comment. Hi Paul, Anna Alves here. Thank you for the great talk. Looking forward to reading your book. I've been focusing on NVM Gonzalez and his training with Wallace Stegner, also an Iowa grad at Stanford as well as the Tiempos and Paul Engel at Iowa. So it will be a very edifying reading. No? I don't know if Paul, you want to respond to that comment?
Well, one, I'm very excited, Anna, that you're doing this work, this research. I think, Conchita Cruz has, also been thinking about this kind of circuit of creative writing and the Filipino novel in English. I certainly benefited from her research, from Professor Cruz's research. I visited the archives at Stanford, and there are documents pertaining to Gonzalez training under Wallace Stegner. And I think, yeah, like thinking about the Stanford, Iowa connection and where Filipinos are, their role in that. Yeah, that's a story to be told. In my American Quarterly piece, I suggested how Stegner, he was part of a literary movement that looked at that focused on the regional. It was a kind of regional literature, and I think Gonzalez got a lot of his, what Filipino critics will describe as his kind of native poetics, his pastoralism. Um, Obviously, there are antecedents in Philippine literary history, like um, who wrote My Brother Leon? Manuel Aguirre? I think, yeah. So, clearly that's an antecedent, but I think having studied under Stegner, I think Gonzalez also was very much inspired by the kinds of fiction that Stegner himself was writing. So yes, I encourage you to continue doing that work on Gonzalez and Stegner.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so anyone else who has a question or comment? Perhaps, Paul, while we're waiting for additional questions, we'll have time to for you to discuss a bit the Agoncillo intertext that you mentioned in the lecture.
What did I have to say about that? So the national historiography, it's its own kind of field formation. And I myself am still kind of learning about it. But from what I've gathered is that, and for the historians in the room, and by all means chime in. But from what I gathered is that when Agoncillo published The Revolt of the Masses, it was very controversial because the Revolt of the Masses really decentered the emphasis that had been canonically placed on Rizal, right? And thinking about the Philippine Revolution, that for generations of historians, it really was like Rizal, 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 Rizal. And with the Revolt of the Masses, well, Gonzalo, his thesis was that like actually it wasn't just the mestizos, right? It was also the masses, and he focused on Bonifacio. So there was kind of this shift in class that completely reoriented um, how to write Philippine history and the aims of a nationalist historiography of what a kind of anti-colonial uh, history of the Philippines would look like. I think this was also the time when you have someone like Renato Constantino writing too, with the miseducation of the Filipino, right? Kind of the late 1950s, early 1960s. So the subject of Philippine history, not just as an empirical discipline, right, what you can find in the archive, but as a kind of interpretive problem, I think was something that Agoncillo's work really brought to the surface. And there, I think also, with Nolledo's But for the Lovers, we get a completely different kind of historical fiction where history is assimilated, is absorbed into the narrative architecture of the novel itself in such a way that history is not just a background, right? But it becomes kind of the raw material for for fiction itself. What Hayden White would call like meta history or something like that. Um, so yeah, the kind of meta historical fiction that Gina Apostle would write, or Jessica Hagedorn even, right? I think they all trace back to Nolledo. And Nolledo's experiment in historical fiction was itself, I think, it's a novelist response to what was happening in the Department of History and universities in the Philippines. Um, so yeah, so that's how I'm thinking through. And and with the Agoncillo work, I think I was also thinking about the question of that preoccupied this generation of scholars. Um, what role does the middle class play? Right? Because I think the middle class was emergent. Was a middle class that was being educated at universities like Ateneo and the University of the Philippines, who were taking these courses in Philippine history. Um, and Agoncillo's polemic was, what if the emergent middle class of today um, listen to the masses, listen to people like Bonifacio, and not only valorize or lionize figures like Jose Rizal. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Mhm.
We have here a question from Julian. Hi, Paul. Thanks for the sharp grounding of the work. I have a practical question. I'm just curious what happened to this other subsequent novel, Sangria Tomorrow and Via Con Virgo, which won the Palanca Awards in the 1980s. What could have prevented him or his estate from publishing them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I know that Nolledo was trying to get his other novels published. There was an imprint by Jackie Kennedy herself, the first lady. She wanted to start a press and was actually in conversation with Nolledo. And in the archives, there is a letter from 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 Jacqueline Kennedy corresponding with Nolledo. But also, the last correspondence of that sequence is Kennedy ultimately rejecting to publish Nolledo's new novel. Um, I know that his Nolledo's wife, Blanca, Mrs. Blanca Nolledo, has been trying to get um, his unpublished works out there. I don't know what the update is on that. But yeah, I think certainly it would be great for someone to compile his unpublished works or put together a new anthology of his short stories, his drama. He has publications in Iowa journals when he was a student that are kind of, you know, scattered, and it would be beneficial to have kind of a single volume of his works. Um, yeah, so I don't know the full picture, but that's a little bit of the fragments that I know.
And here's a question from Maggie Bernabe. Do you think we should study Nolledo alongside Rizal, Joaquin, and NVM Gonzalez in terms of the novel being a microcosm of Philippine culture or history as required reading in college? Or would you reserve the novel as a study for literature or linguistics students?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I would formulate it as mutually exclusive. I think, so yeah, certainly the novel of these writers, Rizal, Joaquin, Gonzalez, they have an intrinsic value to the study of Philippine culture and history, that as fiction, they shed light to national formation in ways that um, um, other media, you know, um, they do, but fiction and narrative does it differently. And also for students of linguistics, by virtue of the fact that what we have here are novels about Filipino identity, novels about the Philippine nation, novels about the Philippine history written in a foreign language. So I think from a linguistic point of view, we get a kind of distancing or kind of second order representation, you know, by virtue of the kind of linguistic difference and, what is being signified, as it were. Um, and then more locally with Nolledo, yeah, I would be, I'd be keen on reading uh, a scholar of linguistics, kind of just making sense of the syntax and, you know, Um, I'm sure there's all kinds of linguistic idiosyncrasies that could be technically specified. Um, yeah, the Rizal, Joaquin Gonzalez, and I was happy to see too Linda T. Casper's novel. There was a prior lecture, and Exploding Galaxies also reissued one of her novels. Um, the Philippine literature in English, it's a formidable field, but it's also, a lot of work still needs to be done. I was very glad to hear that Professor Varick offers classes on Philippine literature in English. Certainly, his book, in Children of the Post-Colony, provides us with an indispensable social intellectual history for thinking about nationalism and literature and culture. Um, but yeah, I think people who can do work in Spanish and American literature to do that kind of comparative work, and not to speak of also, Philippine literature in English's relation to the vernacular tradition, to Tagalog literature, to Cebuano literature. I know Rizal Mojares has also been doing that work, right? But yeah, I think there's 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 more to be done.
Um, we maybe have time for one last question or
Sure. Yeah.
comment.
Yeah, I'm realizing it's midnight here at Princeton. And you know, I'm getting old these days. I usually sleep at 10 p.m.
Thank you very much, Paul, for giving us your
Yeah.
time for this opportunity to learn from your work and from your research. Um, Yeah, perhaps if I may, I have just a very quick question if there's no more from the participants. But this has to do with your upcoming book, Remittances. And I find the premise of the book very compelling, the English novel itself as a remittance. No? But today, as we for sure, there are interventions from publishers, from writers themselves. There are international book festivals that we can, meaning Filipino writers can go to, etc. How do you imagine the dynamics perhaps changing in the future of that kind of remittance between maybe the US and the Philippines?
That's a really good question. So I think the dominant model for thinking about remittances and exchange, right? How the economic and the literary kind of converge. I think that was definitely like a kind of colonial Cold War moment. Colonial insofar as if you have the colonial tutelage sending pensionados to the U.S. and some of them were writers and they wrote novels and they remitted their novels. And in the Cold War, Rockefeller Foundation sponsored, systematically recruited Filipino talent in order to for them to help spread ideals of American democracy and governance, et cetera, et cetera. And in the contemporary, we kind of still get the Cold War Iowa model insofar as we get the international prestige economy. We have the kind of cultural capital of winning prizes and certainly writing in the Anglophone, global Anglophone mode. So, you can think here of Miguel Suyuco, etc. But I think in terms of the future direction, that thinking about the Filipino novel in English as a kind of remittance where that takes us, it reminds me of I'm just finalizing really going through proofs of my Bulosan chapter. And for Bulosan, literature was not just this object that one sends, either as a gift or something as having value, but is also kind of project as the product of mutual aid, right? That when um, when his comrades were sick or when he was sick, he would write these poems in order for people to come together to pool funds, right? Either to help aid for a legal defense of a Filipino migrant facing deportation or something like that, or just needing medical expenses paid, right? Poetry becomes an occasion to pool money together. So there you get kind of literature and money converging. So, thinking ahead, you're right that the geographical reference of Philippine literature in English is not just the US anymore. It's also Canada. And I think there's also literary communities emerging in the Middle East. And I would like to see a kind of more grassroots, bottom-up vision of literary exchange and um, creative work being done and what it would mean for the literary arts to participate in the kind of redistribution of resources and knowledge, right? A different kind of remittance economy than one that issues from state departments or the Rockefeller Foundation, etc. Yeah, so that's how I would respond. I didn't think of it in those terms, but your question just, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. If we may, no, there's one more question in the chat, and this comes from Francine Racimo, an undergrad in of art studies in UP Diliman. No? Their question is, given that a lot of us here are women or are feminine presenting bodies, can you comment on Apostol's foreword where she salvages Alma from allegorical reading, women's bodies as metaphor for nation, and what I would describe as a certain kind of violence through what Tajar calls collective subjective practices.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll just keep my remarks brief, but certainly for the male writers, they're working within, they can't, they're seduced by the traps of romantic nationalism. Um, the trope of the woman as a nation is pretty prominent, especially for the earlier writers like Maximo Cala, Juan Laya, even Carlos Bulosan is not innocent, this kind of idealization of female characters as bearers of national significance and national futurity. Um, but Francine, I think your intuition is correct that in spite of these instrumentalizations of gendered bodies in the work of fiction, right? That something to kind of invoke Nefertiti Tadiar here, something remains or falls away from these captures, instrumental captures of gendered bodies. And I think it's a task of the critic to pursue those things that aren't quite fully captured, that might um, nevertheless persist in as traces in the work themselves. Um, yeah, and Apostle's novels. I mean, yeah, Gina is not just kind of recovering, foraging for traces. I mean, she's writing whole novels that completely, um, um, yeah, decenters kind of the masculine tradition. So, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And friends, join me in giving a big hand to Paul. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much also for everyone who participated. Again, this is the lecture series on States of the Filipino Novel, no? And the lecture series is presented by the Literary and Cultural Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University and Exploding Galaxies in cooperation with Critica Cultura and Bloom. So please follow our social media accounts, no? So that you are updated with the events, the future events that the program Exploding Galaxies and Critica Cultura will be hosting. So again, thank you everyone. Thank you, Paul, for giving us your time and giving us your for this very compelling conversation.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much. And, everyone keep in touch. Send me an email, especially keep, there are all these amazing thinkers in the room, and it seems, projects that are being undertaken. So I'd love to continue the conversation. And yeah, to this wonderful group, you guys have just been so